All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a YouTube video that features, well, a bit of an unusual mix. We've got Polish psychic Krzysztof Jackowski, and he's talking about, get this, the future of the US dollar, and sharing some pretty spooky personal stories too.
Yeah, it's definitely not your typical financial forecast. We're going to be jumping between global economics, the rise of new world powers, and, oh yeah, premonitions, maybe even some psychic intuition.
Okay, so let's just dive right in. Jackowski predicts the US dollar, the one we all use, might lose its top spot as the world's leading currency. He says we should keep an eye on the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
It's interesting because, the BRICS, they've been gaining economic strength for quite a while now. And Joukowsky even goes so far as to suggest they might create their own currency, backed by gold, to compete with the dollar. Imagine that. It would really shake things up. How would trade change? I mean, would we see some countries benefit while others struggle?
That's a lot to think about. And it gets even more interesting, or maybe a little strange, when Jackowski claims the U.S. is, well, doing some unusual things to hold on to its economic power. He even brings up the U.S. trying to, well, buy Greenland.
Okay, so that's where things get really complex. The U.S., no doubt, is facing some economic challenges. The national debt is huge, and other countries are definitely challenging its influence. Now, Greencom is trying to buy Greenland a sign of desperation. Well, that's debatable. But it does show how the global scene is changing, and countries, well, they have to adapt, right?
Right, adapt or be left behind. Jackowski also says the U.S. might have to start working with new allies, but maybe on terms that aren't so favorable.
Yeah.
Like the U.S. might need to make some, let's say, difficult compromises.
Well, it's true that if the BRICS really start to gain more power, well, the existing alliances, they might change drastically. Some countries might be forced to, well, pick a side or maybe negotiate from a weaker position. It could shift the whole balance of power globally.
Okay, so we've got these potential economic earthquakes on the horizon, but Jackowski doesn't stop there. He goes on to tell these pretty wild personal stories about premonitions and psychic experiences he's had. I mean, he's claiming to have predicted everything from car accidents to, well, let's just say some very specific events.
And this is what makes this deep dive so interesting, right? It brings up the whole question of psychic abilities and can we really predict the future? There's a lot of skepticism around these kinds of claims, and for good reason. But we're going to look at what Jackowski says and, well, see if it holds up under scrutiny.
Okay, so one story that really grabbed my attention was about these three guys Jackowski met at a restaurant. He suddenly gets this, like, really vivid vision of them in a horrific car crash.
Yeah.
And the detail, I mean, he describes the scene. It's chilling. He talks about a forested area, a truck being involved, the whole 9 yards.
The really strange part is that Jackowski actually goes up to these complete strangers and tells them about his vision. And according to him, they actually confirmed that they were on a long drive to Holland, which, well, it matched up with his premonition. That's a creepy coincidence, right?
Definitely gave me chills. But, could it be a case of confirmation bias? That thing where we tend to focus on the information that supports what we already believe. Maybe Jackowski remembered this story because it kind of proved his psychic abilities, even if there were other times his predictions were, well, wrong.
Confirmation bias is definitely something we have to consider. It's easy to remember when you're right and forget when you're wrong, especially with something as, well, subjective as psychic phenomena. So a healthy dose of skepticism, absolutely warranted.
Absolutely. Okay, you ready for another one? Jackowski tells this story where he's in a car that's supposedly never been in an accident, but he has this overwhelming feeling of death, like surrounding the car. Later, he finds out that the driver actually died tragically.
Now, this story brings in an interesting idea. It's called residual energy. This idea that the energy of past events can, like, linger in objects or places. You see this concept in a lot of spiritual traditions.
Okay, goosebumps officially activated. But the story that really, truly shook me was Jackowski's own near-fatal car accident. He describes feeling almost forced to take a certain route, and it leads him straight into a crash with his daughter and her boyfriend in the car. And then, get this, right after their accident, 2 more accidents happen in the same spot.
That story really makes you think about, well, fate versus free will, right? I mean, if Jackowski felt compelled to take that route, does that mean it was always going to happen? Or could he have chosen a different route and avoided the whole thing?
And if he had taken a different route, would those other accidents still have happened? It's really hard to even wrap your head around.
Yeah, it's a real mind bender. There's no easy answer, obviously. But it makes you wonder about, like, the forces at play in our lives. Do we actually have control over our destiny? I mean, who knows?
Seriously,
Yeah.
it makes you question everything. We've got these economic predictions,
Yeah.
and yeah, I'm rethinking my retirement plan, and then these mind-blowing stories that are challenging, well, my whole understanding of how the world works. So where do we even go from here? What's
It's
the connection between these two things? Does Jackowski think his economic predictions are based on, well, his psychic abilities?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? Does he have some kind of inside track to the future? Or are these economic predictions just, based on his analysis of current trends?
Well, he doesn't really come right out and say it, but there's definitely that underlying suggestion that maybe, just maybe, his psychic abilities are giving him a glimpse into what's going to happen economically.
It's kind of tempting to connect the dots that way, isn't it?
But I guess we got to be careful about assuming causation just because we see, like, a correlation.
Hmm.
Just because he makes economic predictions and claims to have psychic abilities, it doesn't necessarily mean one is, well, influencing the other.
Right, like that old saying, correlation doesn't equal causation. There could be other factors at play that, we're not even thinking about.
Okay, so how should we be thinking about his economic predictions then? Are we supposed to, like, take them seriously or just file them under interesting but probably not going to happen?
I think the sweet spot is somewhere in between blind faith and just, completely dismissing him. We don't want to just take his word for it, but it's worth considering his arguments and comparing them to what's actually happening in the global economy.
Well, he makes some pretty valid points about, the BRICS nations becoming more powerful. And, I mean, it's no secret that the U.S. dollar is, well, facing some challenges. So maybe he's onto something, even if his reasoning is a little unconventional.
Absolutely. The rise of the BRICS, that's a real thing. And economists are already discussing the potential for, well, a shift in global financial power. The US dollar might still be king, for now, but its dominance is definitely being tested.
So what does all this mean for, us regular people? If Joukowski's right and the dollar actually declines, what kind of impact could that have on our lives?
Well, think about it this way. A weaker dollar could mean higher prices for anything that's imported. It could affect travel costs and investments, but, there's a flip side. It might also make American products more competitive overseas, yeah, right? It's a complex issue, lots of potential winners and losers.
Okay, so a lot to think about on the economic front.
Yeah.
But let's go back to those personal stories for a second. Joukowski really stresses the importance of listening to your intuition, especially when it comes to, like, warnings or premonitions. He practically begs people to, not ignore those gut feelings, even if they seem strange or don't make sense.
Yeah, and that brings up an interesting point about, well, the role of intuition in our lives. Plenty of people have stories about having a hunch that turned out to be right, even if they couldn't, explain why logically. And while science may not fully understand intuition yet, it's a very real phenomenon.
So you're saying we should all be tuning into our inner psychic and trusting every, like, random feeling we get?
Not necessarily. It's more about finding a balance, I guess. We don't want to let intuition completely run our lives, but we shouldn't ignore it either. It can be a valuable source of information, especially when you combine it with logic and critical thinking.
Right, like it's another tool in our decision-making toolbox. We just got to learn to use it wisely, right?
Exactly. In a world where we're, constantly overwhelmed with information, sometimes that quiet inner voice can offer a different perspective that we might miss otherwise.
Okay, so intuition is something to pay attention to. But what about those times when, well, it feels like something is pushing you in a certain direction, almost like you have no choice? Joukowski's story about, his car accident, it really makes you wonder about fate.
Yeah, that story really opens up the whole free will versus determinism debate. If Joukowski felt, compelled to take that specific route, does that mean it was always going to happen? Or could he have made a different choice and avoided the accident?
And if he hadn't taken that route, I mean, would those other accidents have still happened? Man, it's crazy.
Yeah, no easy answer to that one. But it definitely makes you think about, well, the forces at play in our lives. Do we really have control over our destiny? It's a big question.
It really is. So we've got these economic predictions that, well, they're definitely making me rethink my retirement plan. And then these mind-blowing personal stories that are challenging, well, my understanding of reality itself. So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What do we want them to, walk away with after this deep dive?
I think for me, the big takeaway is staying curious, and open-minded. Jackowski, he presents a lot of information, and some of it's pretty out there, but he also encourages us to think critically, to question what we think we know. I agree, yeah. Whether you buy into his psychic claims or not, Jackowski definitely makes you stop and think about things from a different perspective. He's like that friend who always asks those questions that make everyone else go, huh, I never thought of it that way before.
Exactly. And that's valuable in itself, right? In a world where we're constantly bombarded with like information and opinions, it's more important than ever to be able to step back and analyze things critically and come to our own conclusions.
And that's what we've tried to do in this deep dive. We haven't just accepted Jackowski's claims, without question. We've looked at the evidence, considered different perspectives, and, well, encouraged you to do the same.
We've explored the potential for some pretty big economic changes, the psychology of intuition, and even that age-old question of fate versus free will. It's been a wild ride.
And the journey doesn't have to end here. We want you to keep thinking about these questions, keep exploring these topics, and we'll keep challenging your own beliefs.
Okay, so to wrap things up, I think it's time for the big question. Do we believe Krzysztof Jackowski? After all this, where do we land on the believability scale?
I think that's a question each listener has to answer for themselves. We've presented the information, highlighted how complex it all is, and offered different perspectives. In the end, it comes down to your own personal belief system, your own experiences, and, well, how much weight you're willing to give to someone like Jackowski.
He definitely tells a compelling story.
Yeah.
And his predictions, both economic and personal, are definitely, well, thought-provoking, to say the least.
But it's important to remember that, what we're dealing with here, these are subjective experiences,
Yeah.
not hard scientific facts. The realm of psychic phenomena is, well, by its very nature, it's hard to prove or disprove.
So maybe the real question isn't whether we believe him, but whether his ideas resonate with us.
Yeah.
Whether they make us question what we think we know and consider new possibilities.
Yeah, I like that. Whether we walk away as believers or skeptics or, somewhere in between, Jackowski has definitely given us a lot to think about.
He's definitely sparked some fascinating conversations about, well, economics, intuition, and the nature of reality itself. That's what the deep dive is all about. We want to challenge your thinking, expand your horizons, and, well, yeah, maybe leave you with more questions than answers.
Because in the end, it's those questions that keep us learning and growing and, exploring the world with open minds and curious hearts.
So to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to, well, continue this deep dive on your own. What resonated most with you today? What new avenues of exploration have opened up for you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, happy deep diving.